Hey everybody, I'm still getting everything set up on the new PC, so I figured that for this week I would go with something a bit light, and decided that it's a perfect opportunity to take a look at Quake II RTX, which is a reimagining of Quake II using modern ray tracing graphics techniques, and it was released as a free download by Nvidia, so you can get it on Steam. But if you don't own a copy of Quake 2, then you can't get access to all of the levels. You're restricted to just the shareware version, which is actually what you're seeing here, not because I don't own a copy of Quake 2, I own several at this point, but because I just didn't feel like installing the full version of Quake 2 just to mess around with RTX stuff. Because at the end of the day, this really is just a graphics tech demo, so what exactly do you have here? Well, gameplay-wise, it's just Quake 2. But they added in a flare mechanic so you can play around with the ray-traced lighting, which I will admit is very cool technology. It gives developers an opportunity to make far more realistic and immersive lighting and shadows. This ray tracing technology also extends to reflective surfaces, so if you have, say, a mirror, then you can have a more realistic and immersive mirror than you would have previously. It's a very cool technology that, as you might expect in the earliest implementations, wasn't much more than a gimmick. Performance on the initial RT-capable cards, the 20 series, was pretty poor, so unless you were just going for screenshots or something, you wouldn't really play games with RT enabled. But that changed with the 30 series cards, which had considerably improved ray tracing performance and would actually let you play it at acceptable frame rates, or at least vaguely playable frame rates depending on what resolution you're at. Obviously, if you're running 4K in ray tracing, then you're going to have some trouble. But I'm running 1080p because that's my monitor's native resolution. So running games with RT enabled is actually a lot more feasible for someone like me than it is for somebody who's going for bleeding edge tech and is going for 4K and trying to get 60 FPS out of it. At resolutions like 4K, you'll definitely need to be making some compromises to make sure it runs acceptably. But so far, with the limited amount of testing I've done, because I don't really have all that many games that have RT support, I actually haven't needed to worry about it as much. Quake II RTX is a bit of an exception because it actually runs really well even if you are on a sort of first-gen RT card like the 20 series. But to be fair, one would hope it would run pretty well considering that the original game came out in 1997. So what is performance like on my rig? Well, as you can see from the frame rate counter in the top left, it's pretty good. Obviously I'm running this at 1080p with everything cranked up to max, and it's getting well over 100 frames per second at all times. Thing is that I would kind of expect that given what I went with for the hardware in this rig, which is a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64GB of RAM, and an RTX 3080 12GB model. Some of you hardware junkies out there may be saying, DW, that is complete overkill for 1080p. I am well aware that that is complete overkill for 1080p. I specifically went with hardware that is considered complete overkill for 1080p because I do video recording and video editing and compiling all on the same machine that I'm doing gaming on. And from the limited amount of testing I've done so far, that was a very sound decision. I'm not seeing any performance degradation at all when I'm recording videos, and I haven't noticed any desync on that either, which is also a good thing because I've had to change the method I'm using to record things. I'm not really sure what's going on with it, but OBS is being pretty weird on this machine. It's what I was using previously to record gameplay, but now I've gone back to Shadowplay, and that seems to be working perfectly fine. Not sure what's going on with that, but I'll figure it out eventually, I'm sure. I was pretty concerned about using Shadowplay because when I've used Shadowplay previously, it has had all manner of audio desync, but that doesn't seem to be a problem anymore, so yay! Whatever the case, everything seems to be working quite well, so the testing of the new machine has gone very swimmingly. And in that regard, Quake II RTX has definitely served its purpose. But what about Quake II RTX itself? How is it as some sort of modification or tweaked release of Quake II? Well, here's the thing. It is still Quake II. And Quake II is still my favorite game in the Quake series. And it's not like they did anything to the gameplay mechanics. This is still Quake 2, so it still plays really well and it's still a lot of fun. But as cool as the RTX technology is, Unfortunately, it makes Quake 2 look absolutely terrible. I mean, as cool as it is to look at, say, water or glass-type panels and see the environment and characters reflecting off of them in real time with really smooth, nice graphics, and as cool as it is to see lights and various light sources like energy projectiles and such creating light in spaces in real time and really affecting that in a much more realistic way, it all just completely ruins that grungy industrial aesthetic that the original game was going for. Everything in Quake II RTX just looks way too shiny. The lights are way too blown out in some areas, and in other areas everything is so dark that you can't see what you're doing, whereas in the original game that wasn't the case. And of course, that's not to mention that the RTX technology is really meant for much more realistic simulation-type graphics, and Quake 2 was never meant to be anything remotely resembling realistic. Not only were they doing that from an aesthetic standpoint, but it was just a matter of the technology of its time. You had very blocky models, very low-res textures, and they didn't do anything to touch all of that up in Quake 2 RTX. You're still dealing with those low-res textures and low-res models. So seeing all of that with very fancy new lighting and reflection tech just looks weird, for lack of a better way of describing it. I mean, it's kind of like when you look at projects that turn 2D games into full-on 3D ones, like those mods for Doom and Duke Nukem 3D and such, where they change all of the sprites into 3D models. You can appreciate the effort that went into those things, but they just don't really feel like they belong there. They just look odd. And that's kind of the same effect you get with Quake II RTX, except that instead of going from, say, 2D sprites to 3D models, it's a complete overhaul to the lighting system and the introduction of reflective surfaces. On paper, that may not seem like all that much, but in practice, it just completely ruins the aesthetic of Quake 2 and just makes it less enjoyable. So while I can certainly appreciate Quake 2 as a sort of tech demo to show you what the RTX technology can bring to the table, it's not something I would recommend actually playing if you're just trying to enjoy Quake 2. You're better off just playing a source port. Sure, that'll require more setup, but you're getting the experience more or less as it was intended, just with some extra convenience features like making multiplayer easier to set up and play, or being able to play it in widescreen or things like that. And I will easily take the inconvenience of having to set up the source port to work properly and make sure that the soundtrack works properly and everything, over just quickly installing Quake II RTX and having to deal with the game looking like this. So, yeah, the technology's cool, but its implementation in Quake 2? Not so much. That said, it did remind me that I really need to get around to doing a redux of Quake 2 along with its expansion packs, so I'll be setting about doing that fairly soon. I've already done a redux of Quake 4, which will be going up on Saturday, so stay tuned for that. And while I certainly don't have an ETA for you on when the Quake 2 redux is going to happen, it'll hopefully be within the next several weeks. So stay tuned for that as well, and thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, like in the case of the new PC. The past year or so of Patreon funding went towards that, so for those of you who've been contributing to the Patreon, thank you all very much. You helped me get this machine done sooner rather than later. And now that the new machine's set up, video production is going to be a lot smoother, and you're also going to be seeing videos on the latest games that I really wasn't able to reliably record on the previous PC, like, say, Cyberpunk 2077 or Deathloop or so on and so forth. So to those of you who've been contributing to the Patreon over the years, thank you again very much for that. It has definitely been helping out quite a lot. And as for those of you who can't afford to contribute to the Patreon or don't want to, that is perfectly fine. I understand. The option's there if you're interested, though. Thank you all again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.